Welcome. This is my very first public Dharma talk, so I'm very honored to be here. And I just really want to thank the community here. It's just wonderful to have you all here and be able to do this in person. And thank you to Roshi. She's either on her way back or should be in her room with the dog. It's such a gift to have been here in the last few years, being able to practice with everyone. And so today's my first talk. So it is a way-seeking mind talk. And the title of this talk is Learning to Unlearn. And I was explaining to my friends, she's probably online right now, Sasha, what a way-seeking mind talk is the other day. And I was telling her how it's really an introductory talk about, how I got here, how I got to be here and be motivated to search for something more. And she was like, wow, that's a good practice for you because you hate talking about yourself. She knows me so well. Thank you, Sasha. So so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I got here. And so the definition of way-seeking mind talk is really why, how I got here to be searching for something more. But then I was thinking about it, is it something more or really something less? So that's why this talk is called Learning to Unlearn. Actually, can I have the clock, please? Thank you. Thanks. So how did I get here to be sitting in front of the Zendo wearing these robes? Thank you, Hunt. Wearing these robes, and if you ask my younger self, it would be a huge surprise that I would even be in these robes. It's so strange. I grew up in Hong Kong, in colonial Hong Kong before the handover, and then moved here when I was 15. Because of that, I never really felt that connected to my culture or my lineage. And Buddhism and ancestors, all of that is really what old people do. And like I was subconsciously rejecting all of that when I was growing up. So it's definitely a huge surprise that I would be sitting here in robes. So how did I get here? So I was thinking how to start. And I remember this one moment 2 years ago when I decided to put these robes on, to ordain. I was up at the Prajna Mountain Refuge, which you all will be going to soon. And during that first year of the pandemic, I was living up there with Roshi. I had a little hut and she has a little hut on the other side. And we were living there out in the wild. I was really didn't expect to even be in New Mexico. I kind of got here after I moved away from New York City, and then I bought a van and didn't know where I was going. So I was just driving around for months and months and living in my van. And this ended up here before the Nomads Clinic, which I'm part of, and then just ended up here after the Nomads Clinic. And then the pandemic happened. And so I just stayed, which is I'm so grateful for. I mean, I don't know where I would be if the pandemic didn't happen. And so I was up there sitting on the back porch of Prajna. I sat there for so many hours that summer, that whole spring and summer, just practicing, reading, and writing a lot, and absorbing the news of what was going on in the world. And I remember that one afternoon, it was that summer. If you guys all remember, it was the summer where the fires in California happened. And the smoke of the fire was all the way here in New Mexico. And the sky was filled with smoke. And you know how that we just had that happen here as well. When that happens, when the sun sets, the whole sky is orange. It's quite beautiful, but it was also apocalyptic. I remember just like sitting like on a cushion on the porch and just looking at the apocalyptic sky and just reflecting on everything that was happening in the world. The pandemic of all these people dying, and all my friends who are in the ER still working were just suffering through the pandemic and just was scared. And it was quite a time. And at that time, Hong Kong was also in it, they had lots and lots of protests. And I was there for the protests the year before. And then there were also protests in New York. So just so many things was happening at that time. And I just was looking at the sky and just reflecting, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to serve? If the world is really coming to an end, if it's climate change, is really, we're really looking at, maybe the last years of the earth being the way it is. I mean, it's changing already, but how am I going to serve? What am I going to do with my life? So it just became apparent all of a sudden in that moment that I will ask Roshi to ordain as a priest. And obviously that was a surprise to me. I didn't ever think I would do that. And it still took me another month or so to ask her. I would, see her for walks every day, but then every day I'm on the walk, I'd be like, should I ask her now? I don't know. So it took me another month to be able to do that. And when I did that, she was like, oh, I've just been waiting for you to ask. Of course you should ordain. And so, like I said, growing up in Hong Kong is one of the most capitalist cities where, the primary mark of success or anything is how much money you have and how successful and powerful. And, and so everything, and it's such a built up city. I always grew up and I always lived in these big cities. So everything about that moment was a surprise to me. Living in the wild surrounded by millions of acres of forest, having a dog by my side, no plumbing, and, contemplating shaving my head off. All of that was a huge surprise. So, thinking back on how I even got to that moment was really, I saw that there were two paths. There's a path of learning and a path of unlearning that was parallel, and kind of I felt almost split in two for a long time until I found Zen, until I found Roshi's teachings, and it really felt like coming home and coming together of those two paths. So let me explain. So, as most of you know, I'm a physician. I was an ER doc for many years in New York City. And I've taken a few years off now, and I'm about to go back into medicine, doing something different. I'm going to be doing addiction medicine. And in fact, I'm starting a new part-time job next week. I went to med school after a first career in technologies. It was during the first internet bubble. I was a computer science major, and I was so excited to move to San Francisco after that. And I was living in London, living in San Francisco. That technology was accelerating at that time. It was the first time we were really using the internet. But then after a few years, I realized that I was just really doing the same thing. I was just making websites to sell things. So it's just another capitalist, goal. And this is no different than anything else, except, the medium was different. So after a few years, I realized that, I wanted to serve. At that time, I probably thought about just helping and fixing, that the difference between helping, fixing, and serving. I mean, I didn't really know better, but I wanted to live a life of meaning. I wanted to live a life of purpose. So I went back to med school. I went back to school and got into school in New York City. And that's why I moved back there. And after med school in, the Ivory Tower, it was a wonderful education, but I felt pretty cloistered. I wanted to serve where I'm most needed. So I decided to do emergency medicine in, the way in the middle of Brooklyn, in the heart of Brooklyn, because I wanted to see it all. And I wanted to serve those who most need it. During those 4 years of residency, all my patients were basically didn't have insurance. Most of my patients were undocumented. It was wonderful to be able to serve like that, to be able to feel like I was really using my skills and learning how to be with people. But it was also really hard. It was really intense because there was a lack of resources there. We were pushed to see patients as fast as possible. Sometimes there would be, 70, 80 people waiting in the waiting room for hours, 7 hours, 8 hours. And it was, the training was really interesting. I mean, I got to do the most mundane things, but also got to do the most intense things. I learned, how to crack open people's chests, deliver babies in emergencies, all kinds of things. But I also saw so much suffering. And it was kind of skewed. You only see the suffering when you're in the ER. It's people in their most dire needs. And, I saw suffering from inequity, from gun violence, from racism, from poverty. And the population there was so underserved that they had their own diseases. There was a thing called flatbush diabetes, which really only happens there, that they coined the term there. That people were so undiagnosed with their diabetes at a much older age that they went into diabetic coma, which is completely unheard of anywhere else, in the US, that is. So, it was both a privilege and an eye-opening experience, but also heartbreaking to be able to serve there. At that time, nobody taught me grace. I didn't know about the 3 tenets. I didn't know how to hold the suffering that I saw. I didn't know how to grieve. And every day I witnessed, suffering, and I was morally injured. I didn't have those words at that time, but just from practicing medicine in an environment that had a different value from me. There was the push for efficiency. There's, for-profit medicine mostly in a lot of places that I worked. So I just remember this one day when I walked into work, maybe 4 or 5 years out of residency. I was like, I don't know, how am I going to do this for another 30 years? Most people retire when they're 60, 65. I had another 20, 30 years to go. I just couldn't imagine doing that for that long. And just to reflect, right now, I'm in touch with so many of my colleagues. After the pandemic, it's been so much worse. And then now practicing in this environment where, there's a threat of being thrown in jail for taking care of women, that is heartbreaking. But even then, I was heartbroken. I just didn't know how it was going to continue. So at that point, I realized that I have to rethink my life. Even though this is so meaningful in a way, I didn't know how I was going to continue it to alleviate suffering in the world without adding, to the suffering by being miserable myself. So that was that path of learning on one side, of learning how to be a physician, learning how to serve practically in that way. And then there's another side of unlearning that was actually going on at the same time in my life. So rewinding back to the beginning of med school, I must have known that this was going to happen. So I just started meditating the first year of med school. I was starting to explore spirituality. I was, reading books and then just started practicing on my own with no instructions at all. And I just kept doing it because I felt a sense of something that I couldn't express in words, something that I needed. So I just kept doing it. And it was a contrast to the super over intellectualization of med school that I was going through. And I kept it separate. It was something that I couldn't talk about really, because we couldn't really talk about anything that's not proven by science in medicine. Now it's a little bit better, but at that time it would have been seemed like it was weird. And at the same time, I was also learning embodied practices like yoga and martial arts, smiling, and intensely. And I started teaching both of those things at the same time as well, after a few years. So I need to put a little plug in because this is a little bit odd of martial arts. Roshi is not here right now. If not, she might turn off my mic. No, but it was another important unlearning for me, actually. It was really unlearning the constraint of being born into a female body. And I wanted to say that because it seems so relevant at this time, of like, it was a way for me to express power and agency and looking fear in the face and kind of rising above pain and anger. So there's a concept in Thai culture that's really expressed in Muay Thai, which is Thai kickboxing, that I was practicing, of Jai Yen. It directly translates to cool heart. It's about learning how to be steady in the face of difficulty, in the face of pain, in the face of anger. And the best fighters in Muay Thai are the ones that are able to keep their cool and not be angered. Because you always think of like martial arts as being this angry thing that you're like, but it's not actually, because, you know, if you think about it, if you're in the ring with somebody and someone is, you know, punching you, and if you get angry, all your training will get lost. There's a saying in boxing, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. I can't believe I'm saying this in the Dharma talk, but but really for me, it's my first learning about equanimity. Really, it's it's such a practical and palpable way of learning equanimity, because you know, if you don't keep your cool, you'll just get lost, and that's a learning that I'm still learning, and it's an aspiration, but it was my first sense of what equanimity is really about. And within that, my practice in Muay Thai, I started teaching meditation and to fighters, which is really cool. I mean, honestly, it's still one of my favorite teaching experiences. I was teaching them, you know, meditation and visualization, and like, you know, tapping into their aspirations, and, you know, learning to work with their anger, their frustration. And some of these people probably have never done meditation before, and maybe will never do it again, but it was just a very fun experience. So I'll stop talking about martial arts and fighting, but I really think that this is why equanimity is really why martial training and spiritual training have had a relationship in history. So another strand of unlearning I had happened at the kind of the end of my medical training. I realized that I needed more guidance in meditation and spirituality. So I actually found a teacher. I think he might be here online right now. If not, he might watch later. But Harshada, who really spoke to me at the time. We're good friends now. So he taught in like non-duality, traditional non-dual yoga, and Shaivism, and also devotional practices. So really combining, you know, a lot of sitting actually with devotional practices. And this was so healing for me at the time, because it was the opposite, not opposite, but it really contrasted and helped me unlearn the over-intellectualization that was happening when I was learning medicine. Because in medicine, it seems like, everything has to be logical, that, everything has to be scientifically proven, and there's no value if things are not proven. So this was really helpful for me. The embodied devotional practices really contrasted that intellectual side and helped me see that there was more to life than this practical. I mean, both are important, but it really helped me see both sides. And I was particularly taken by the idea of the deity Hanuman. And because that path was adjacent to Ram Dass, the bhakti path. And Hanuman was really the representation of selflessness, selfless service in seva, and a complete devotion to show up and serve. So really, Hanuman was my first introduction to the Bodhisattva path. And one of the things that Harshada did was he led pilgrimages to India. So I started going to those, and they were wonderful. It was such a safe container. We were going to like all these holy sites in Western India, and just that immersion into the devotion and bringing me out of the capitalist capital of the world in New York City to this place where, there's no banks on every corner, there was temples on every corner, and people were just, devoted. And usually after each of these pilgrimage, I would try to go to a different place in India to just explore. And after that, there was one particular pilgrimage. I went to South India, to Tiruvannamalai, which is where the ashram of Ramana Maharshi was. I was talking to my friend Amber the other day about this part of my life, because there's a lot of that I don't remember. And she was saying that during that pilgrimage, I was just really striving. I was in this place where I'm like, she was sharing a room with me, and she put up with me, my craziness. I would just be like crying and saying how like the only thing that matters is waking up. And that's all I want to do. Nothing else matters. And I was just like practicing and just really striving and just like in this state. So when I went to South India to the ashram, I just practiced. There are these like caves where he practiced and supposedly where he awakened. And I would just go and practice all day in the heat in this like tiny little cave, or the meditation hall. And there was one hall where there was like a passage written on the wall. And the passage was like, an abbreviated version of his like awakening story. And it was, I tried to find it on the internet, but I couldn't find it. But it was something to do with how he like went from, like he was practicing, and then he was, went from one state, like a human state, to suddenly like awakening to a different like, state of consciousness. And then that's where he stayed. And that really, really, really bothered me. I was like, what? That doesn't make any sense. I sat in front of that passage on the wall and just was staring at it and was like, ugh, this doesn't make sense. And I was just like twisting myself into like a knot. And I was just like, like hours and hours. I was like, no, how do I get from, wait, I'm practicing, but how do I get from here to there? Like, and what is this gap between the two? And so I was like, so frustrated. And it was my birthday. I was there in India by myself on my birthday. And I remember I was so frustrated. So finally I called Harshada, and I was like, this doesn't make sense. Can you help me out? I'm going crazy. And he was like, all right, yeah. These passages are usually written like third, fourth, fifth hand, and they just want to make it like use hyperbole and make it seem like the person went from like human to poof into like deity all at once. And obviously it's not true. I'm like, okay, so what is true then? What is it? What do I have to do? And so he told me the story that he was with his teacher in India, Madhavananda, and they were sitting in outside in the garden, and Madhavananda asked, was like, why do we need to practice? Why don't we just sit outside and in the garden and look at the trees and the birds? And so Parsha was like, well, because when people do that, they get into their heads and they're just going to be like, oh, what is the tree telling me? And it just becomes a mind trip. And then Madhavananda was like, why are people like this then? Like, why? And Harshada started saying something about how, we might have left this shore, but haven't gotten to the other shore yet. So we're just flailing and trying to look for stuff and to help us. And Madhavananda was like, stop. I don't know if he said stop, but he was just like, no, there is no other shore. And his mind just went, poof. And then when he related the story to me, my mind went, poof. And I was like on the phone, I was like, oh no, there's no other shore. And so I was like, okay, I have to go. And so I hung up the phone. And then I just went to bed that night. And the next morning, everything was like, my mind was blown. I was like, there's no other shore. Everything looked really bright. And I just felt like my breath was so soft and tender. And I was in this bliss state. And I was like so happy. I was like, yes, now I can just stay here forever. Yay. But that didn't happen. That was not when I awoken into the next shore. Obviously, there's no other shore. So I stayed in that state for a few weeks. And then when I went home to New York, I just plunged into a state of just everything was falling apart. I was just crazy. I was talking to my friend Amber, and she remembers this. And the good thing is I don't really remember this very well. But she said, you didn't sleep for a year. I'm like, oh, I thought it was just a few months. I just remember just waking up in the middle of the night, just like having panic attacks and I didn't know what was happening. And she told me, I don't remember this, the word I kept using was that I felt uncontained. I don't really know what that means, but that's what it felt like. But what really, really didn't make sense was medicine. I tried to go back to work, and I couldn't. It was quite scary, actually. I knew what to do when I saw patients, but for some reason can't remember anything, and I can't remember the names of things. And it was luckily somehow I didn't hurt anybody, but it was really scary. So the end of that was that I had to stop working for a little while. But then I was totally lost to what I was going to do. So I just kind of floated for a while. This is around the time when I found Roshi, actually. I kind of went back to work here and there when my memory got a little bit better. And I remember going to work. I was doing a traveling gig and coming back from a shift and realizing, I need something else. And at that time, I was fascinated with working with the dying, even though I saw death all the time. Just the idea of death being like a threshold, that it was sacred. All of that was so new to me. And that's when I went online and found Roshi. I found the Grace training, the BW training that night, and I just immediately filled out the application. And then I found Nomads Clinic. I was like, whoa, that's what I want to do. That sounds awesome. So I think that it was the next year after an India pilgrimage. The Grace training was the next day. I was basically went back home to New York, dropped my bag, changed my clothes out, and went back on the plane. I almost didn't come because I was so jet lagged. But I was like, oh, I have to ask Roshi if I can go to Nomads Clinic. So I came, and I asked Roshi, and I was like, can I come? I really want to do this. And she was like, it's March. We already have our team. Maybe next year. I was like, oh no. Can you put me on the list for next year? But she was like, well, what do you do? So I was like, oh, I'm an ER doc. She's like, oh, okay, go fill out the form during the break. So I did. And so then I went that year, and it was just a life-changing experience. That's another strand of unlearning. Being in the Western medical world, there was a wall to me connecting with my patients, because it's just all about diagnosing, and that's very important, but something got lost in there. But at Nomads Clinic, I was able to connect to people, connect to patients. And I remember this like one instant when I realized that like I was just not that medicine, something has been lost for me in medicine, was when we were washing our patients' feet. We have an acupuncture clinic, so we wash their feet before they go into the tent. And I was just like, there was a woman sitting up on the chair, and I was on the ground, and I had like my little bucket, and I was just so intent on washing her feet. I was just looking at her feet, like treating it like, how I would in medicine. I'd be like, okay, I need the soap, I need the brush. And I was like grabbing her feet, and then she was just like pulled back. And I was like, oh, what is she doing? And then I looked up at her, and then just realized how ridiculous the moment was. She was this old lady, and she was just like tickled by me touching her feet. And she just looked at me, and she was like giggling. And I was like, oh, yes, there was like someone attached to those feet. And then I was like, and then we just looked at each other and just started laughing. And that was just such a healing moment for me. I'm just like, oh yeah, there's a person attached to the feet. And just like that connection, that beauty, and that, sharing that moment was beautiful for me. And that started, the journey of wanting to go back to medicine at some point and being different and being connected. And so after that, I just gradually spent more and more time at Upaya, and I did the chaplaincy training, which I'm still finishing. almost done. But then through that, I encountered Zen a little bit more officially. And I've heard a lot of these teachings before, but they never, they were cool, but didn't really make that much sense. But suddenly they were making more sense. Like, the teaching of justice, this is it, suddenly made more sense. It felt like a coming home for me. And, hearing the 4 vows and the night chant that Roshi does on Nomads Clinic, every time she says it, I would just, feel like I'm coming out of my skin, that, life and death are of supreme importance, and time passes swiftly, and opportunity is lost. There's no other shore. So this is it. That we're really actualizing our awakening here. We're not trying to go somewhere else, and just dedicating each moment to service. That made so much sense. And another surprising thing was the connection to the Chinese ancestors. I was reading those koans from the Chinese ancestor book, and and some of them made no sense. I mean, actually, most of them still make no sense. Since we don't do koan practice, I have no idea if I would even pass them. But something about those stories just touched me. It's kind of like being let into an inside joke. There's something about my Chinese ancestry, and just it just makes sense. I felt like there's like something funny about them, and there's like a mirth and a sadness at the same time, and it's just, yeah. And that I have no idea why. It's funny, but I find them very funny and just touches me. And so, these past few years, just being here, I'm just so grateful. Being in Sangha is another unlearning, unlearning self-preservation, of unlearning self-cherishing, and self-centeredness. None of that I, would have chosen to learn. Because, when I first heard about the three jewels, I was like, oh yeah, Buddha, yeah, that's great. I definitely need that. Dharma, yeah, I definitely need that. I need to practice, I need teachings, but Sangha, I don't really need that, right? But then I ended up here and really learning that, Sangha is so important. Having that mirror, having those hairy potatoes, and it's like a process of continuous failure. But it's been so wonderful. Sometimes it's not fun, but but it's still I'm so grateful to have that experience. And so, going back to that moment of the refuge, sitting there and thinking about ordaining, shaving my head off, and also thinking about what my mother would think. But really thinking about, vowing to live by the precepts, living by vow. It's clear to me now that ordaining and living by vow is really a process of unlearning. It's really unlearning that social conditioning and cultural conditioning of, our, and also uncoupling from our past, our traumas. Not that we'll get rid of them or we're bypassing them, but really consciously living by another set of guidelines, instead of unconsciously being led around by our karma. And in the book Living by Vow, Okumura said, vow is essential for all bodhisattvas. In fact, part of the definition of a bodhisattva is a person who lives by vow instead of by karma. Karma means habit, preferences, or a ready-made system of values. As we grow up, we learn a system of values from the culture around us, which we use to evaluate the world and choose actions. This is karma and living by karma. In contrast, a bodhisattva lives by vow. Vow is like a magnet or compass that shows us the direction towards the Buddha. And so here I am, vowing to live by the precepts, continuously failing, but continuously trying, because there is nowhere else, there's no other shore. And just this, just here. So all we can do is practice and serve right here. Because it's a continuous process. We're continuously letting go. And so every Wednesday, you guys all know, but every Wednesday after taking a couple of days of personal practice off, we always start with the verse of atonement. And it's now really my favorite chant. It feels so nourishing. It feels so relieving to say that vow and to say that verse. So I'll leave you with those words. All my ancient twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hatred, and delusion, born of body, speech, and mind, I now fully atone. Thank you.